Let us pray. Our Divine Father, as we conclude for this week our work in this assembly, we renew our thanks and ask that we may continue our work under your guidance. Amen. Members of the Assembly, 75 years ago on this date, July the 18th, 1911, there was founded the Empire Parliamentary Association, which later became the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association. The coronation of King George V in 1911 was considered an appropriate occasion on which to invite representatives from the parliaments of the self-governing dominions to London. Members came from Australia, Canada, South Africa, New Zealand, and Newfoundland, and a joint committee was set up from the Commons and the Lords to arrange the program. Of the initial meeting, Sir Howard wrote, quote, "By the entertainment of the representatives of the Dominion Parliaments at the coronation of His Majesty King George V, it may justly be said that the weakest spot in the combination of sister nations has been, to a large extent, removed. It was the lack of personal contact and association amongst the parliamentarians of the Empire that has sometimes given rise in the past to misunderstanding and lack of appreciation of each other's points of view." End of quote. The meeting of delegates on July the 18th, 1911, approved the formation of the Empire Parliamentary Association. Membership of the association has grown steadily since that time as more and more members of the Empire and then of the Commonwealth achieve self-government and equal status. The report of the Imperial Conference in 1926 referred to the dominions as autonomous communities within the Commonwealth of Nations, a description which still applies to Commonwealth nations today. The Statute of Westminster in 1931 formally recognized them as self-governing communities with equal status and comparable structures. Today, there are 110 member parliaments with more than 8,000 members within the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association. The CPA adopted its present name in 1948 when the Commonwealth was officially recognized. It is the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association that we now celebrate our 75th anniversary on this day. Over the entire period, the association has played a most valuable role in promoting and sustaining fellowship and understanding among members of parliaments from Commonwealth countries, and in so doing has contributed significantly to Commonwealth understanding and stability. I take great pleasure today in presenting to each party leader and to each House leader a Commonwealth Parliamentary Association pin, which was struck especially to mark this 75th anniversary. Additionally, I take special pleasure in presenting to the House one of my predecessors, a former president of the Alberta branch of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, who was at the same time a Speaker of this Legislative Assembly of Alberta. As well, I am pleased to welcome some of the past Deputy Speakers of the Assembly. I ask them to rise in the Speakers' Gallery as I say their names, and I invite my colleagues to join me in welcoming today these special guests: Art Dixon, Lucien Maynard, Bill Diachuk and Mrs. Diachuk, Frank Appleby and Mrs. Appleby.
Introduction of visitors.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to introduce to you, through you to members of the Assembly seated in your gallery today, the new ambassador from Japan to Canada who is visiting Alberta, having just taken up his responsibilities in our country. His Excellency, Mr. Okawa, is accompanied today by the Consul General in Alberta, Mr. Funakoshi, and I would ask that they rise and receive the welcome of the Assembly.
Presenting petitions. Reading and receiving petitions. Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Notices of motions. Introduction of bills.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to introduce Bill number PR5, Alberta Native Business Summit Foundation Act. Mr. Speaker, the purpose of this bill is to incorporate the Alberta Native Business Summit Foundation and to provide for its constitution.
The honourable member for Cypress Redcliffe has moved first reading of Bill PR5, Alberta Native Business Summit Foundation Act. Does the Assembly agree to the motion for first reading? Opposed? Carried.
A bill being Alberta Native Business Summit Foundation Act, introduced by Honourable Member Mr. Hyland, is now read a first time.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce Bill PR8, City of Edmonton and Northwestern Utilities Limited, Agreement Act 1986. Mr. Speaker, the purpose of this bill is to provide for an extension of the franchise for the provision of natural gas to the City of Edmonton by validating an amendment to the original agreement between the City and Northwestern Utilities Limited.
The honourable member for Stony Plain has moved first reading of Bill PR8, City of Edmonton and Northwestern Utilities Limited Agreement Act 1986. Does the Assembly agree to the motion for first reading? Opposed? So ordered.
A bill being City of Edmonton and Northwestern Utilities Limited Agreement Act 1986, introduced by Honourable Member Mr. Herron, is now read a first time.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce Bill PR7, the Calgary Research and Development Authority Amendment Act, 1986. Mr. Speaker, the purpose of this bill is to remove the 5 consecutive year limit on holding office, alter a reference to the title of an ex officio appointee, and to clarify the power to hold land on lease.
The honourable member for Calgary Foothills has moved first reading of Bill PR7, the Calgary Research and Development Authority Amendment Act 1986. Does the Assembly agree to the motion for first reading? Opposed? So ordered.
A bill being the Calgary Research and Development Authority Amendment Act 1986, introduced by Honourable Member Mrs. Coper, is now read a first time.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce Bill PR11, the McMahon Youth Services Foundation Act. Mr. Speaker, the purpose of this bill is to provide for the incorporation and constitution of the foundation.
The honourable member for Edmonton Gold Bar has moved first reading of Bill PR11, the McMahon Youth Services Foundation Act. Does the Assembly agree to this motion for first reading? Opposed? Carried.
A bill being the McMahon Youth Services Foundation Act, introduced by Honourable Member Mrs. Hughes, is now read a first time. Tabling returns and reports.
Mr. Speaker, I have 2 tablings today. First, as required by statute, I wish to table the Gas Alberta Operating Fund financial statements for the year end March 31st, 1985, and the supplemental report of the Gas Alberta Operating Fund for the year end March 31st, And also, Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure to table the annual report of the Department of Utilities and Telecommunications for the year 1984-85.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to table a reply to order for return number 134.
Introduction of special guests.
Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure today to introduce to you and through you to the members of this Assembly two true tourists from Vancouver, British Columbia. This gentleman retired in July of this year after a distinguished 26-year career with the Boy Scouts of Canada, Vancouver region. He happens to be my older brother. I say that because there may be some doubt when he stands up. But it's my pleasure, Mr. Speaker, to introduce Mr. and Mrs. Jack S. Adair, and for Hansard, that's Jack one word, and S for Samuel. I would ask them to stand and receive the warm welcome of this Assembly.
Ministerial statements.
Mr. Speaker, I am very pleased to announce today that the government will implement additional initiatives to provide more employment opportunities for students seeking work this summer. This government recognizes that youth employment, particularly during the summer months, is an immediate problem requiring immediate action. Therefore, these new funds for summer job creation will be made available through two existing Alberta manpower programs, the Wage Subsidy Program and the Summer Temporary Employment Program. As part of this initiative, employers in the private sector can now take additional advantage of the Wage Subsidy Program to create further employment opportunities for students this summer. Approximately 1,800 students are now employed under the Wage Subsidy Program. Under this program, the government, matching funds with the private sector, will create a potential for 500 more student jobs this summer. Should the demand increase beyond this level, necessary funds will be made available. With respect to the Summer Temporary Employment Program, employers can receive wage support for jobs under 4 elements: summer farm, community employment, career opportunity, and provincial government department. Employers eligible under the Summer Temporary Employment Program may create new positions or keep employees already hired under the current program. The Summer Temporary Employment Program deadline has been extended by 30 days to the end of September 1986. Additional funding provided today creates a potential for 1,200 new STEP jobs for students looking for employment this summer. It is particularly difficult for young people to get meaningful work experience. Over the past 14 years, STEP has provided many young Albertans with an opportunity to get a solid start in the job market. STEP also allows students to earn money for continuing their education. The government expenditure for STEP to date is $31.7 million. I might add, Mr. Speaker, that this government's commitment to summer job creation represents the largest per capita initiative in the country. Under STEP's summer farm element, Alberta farmers have been able to give 900 young people farm employment. The community employment and provincial government element have created 11,000 positions. Eligible employers under these elements include provincial departments, non-profit organizations, hospitals, municipalities, Indian bands, Métis settlements, and agricultural societies. The career opportunity element has provided over 1,300 Albertans with work closely related to their field of study. This year to date, some 13,000 Albertans have benefited from STEP. In summary, Mr. Speaker, the Government of Alberta will today put in place expanded student programs that will create an estimated 1,700 new jobs for the balance of this summer. This government is committed to encouraging employment opportunities for young Albertans. These additional funds for job creation will enable public and private sector employers to create jobs for students still searching for work this summer. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Mr. Speaker, just a few comments in reply to the ministerial statement. Certainly, any time that there's any government initiative to create employment, especially for our young people, obviously we welcome it because it is a very serious problem. We in the opposite side here have said that many, many times. I would be interested in knowing, it's not in here, at what sort of wages, especially for students. If it's a minimum wage that people are going to get, that's better than nothing, but it's not going to allow people to save much money for university or college or NAIT or SAIT or whatever institution they may be going to. The only caution I would make, and I recognize, Mr. Speaker, that there has been a lot of money spent by the government in temporary projects. And I would hope at some point that we would take time to evaluate the bang for the buck, in other words, because the unemployment rate is still considerably higher. We know the reasons for that. But perhaps there is a better way to come at it in many of the temporary programs that we have advocated over the last few months. And I wonder about that. If we create employment for a few months and then people are back on unemployment insurance, perhaps we should be taking a look at it. But, Mr. Speaker, obviously if there's 1,300 more young people, or 1,700 new people that are going to be employed, certainly I'm not going to be one that would rain on that because it's desperately needed. Thank you.
Oral question period.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to direct the first question to the Minister of Labour. And during his estimates last night, Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Labour revealed that the review of our labour laws promised in the throne speech will not now begin until after the session is over, I believe. My question to the Minister flowing from that is what assessment have the Minister's officials provided him on the effect this unacceptable delay will have on tensions at picket lines in Slave Lake, Fort McMurray, and then gainers in Edmonton? Is the government somehow under the impression that this procrastination will be helpful?
Mr. Speaker, I've been talking about the review of labour legislation since I was appointed. It's been mentioned several times in this legislature. The exact process, as I indicated last night, we have not decided upon. But obviously the process will have to involve at least myself, and with the sitting progressing, it is difficult to start that process while the House is sitting. I've indicated before that it's our intention to review the labour legislation on the basis of its long-term effects, not in relation to any specific occurrences, and for that reason the review will not address only current labour disputes, but the whole operation of the Labour Relations Act over a long period of time.
Well, supplementary question. The Minister didn't answer the first one, but we'll go into it in some more detail. I would suggest, Mr. Speaker, some urgency. I believe it's one of the worst social crises that the province has faced. Will the Minister outline in more detail what factors are preventing them from getting their act together in order to develop a review mechanism that will allow this legislature to look at some proposed changes before adjournment?
Mr. Speaker, I've had several meetings with senior members of the staff of the department to address what is the best way to put together a process to review the Labour Relations Act. Those meetings are not completed as yet, and therefore I cannot indicate the exact process that will occur. The recommendations I get from my staff members will, of course, have to be taken to my colleagues for their input. As soon as we know the exact process, then I will notify the Assembly. In relation to the current disputes, of course, if we want to go through them one by one, we can describe where they are in the process, but I don't think that's necessary for the members of the Assembly today.
Well, supplementary question. The Minister doesn't seem to feel that there's any urgency. We on the opposite side do feel that there is an urgency. And my question leading from that, and he recalls a demonstration here, people demanding changes, would the Minister reconsider this latest announcement and bring back some proposed changes before this legislature prorogues?
Mr. Speaker, I've said to members of the Alberta Federation of Labour when I met with their executive, to the Building Trades Council, to the Construction Industry Advisory Council, I've said to all of those that rather than have some knee-jerk responses to the immediate situations which may in fact aggravate any difficulties that may exist with the Labour Relations Act, that we intended to do the job properly and on the broad picture rather than on specifics.
It's very nice. We had lots of knee-jerk proposals from this government before, but my question is to the Premier, Mr. Speaker, and it has to do with the throne speech, where it says, a full review of labor legislation will be undertaken by my government, and necessary amendments will be proposed to assure that the laws of the province. That was in this throne speech. My question to the Premier, could the Premier elaborate on the value of throne speech commitments under his administration? Are they worth anything, or do they just occur to take off the political heat at the time?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition read the statement, and the government stands behind the statement.
Supplementary, Leader of the Liberal Party.
It's supplementary to the Minister, Mr. Speaker. Will he ensure or undertake, or will the Minister undertake to ensure that the review will be done by a public task force and provide for interim amendments?
Mr. Speaker, I've stated several times that there is the intention to involve representatives of both management and Labour. Obviously, if one's reviewing the Labour Relations Act, that's a necessity. Whether there are any interim reports or any interim recommendations that come during that process is not up to me to hazard at this time. That's speculative.
The representative party.
Mr. Speaker, a supplementary question to the Minister is with regards to the structure of the review panel, committee, or whatever it may be. The Minister indicated in his answer that the structure was being designed internally by the department in consultation with the Minister. Has the Minister made contact with the Labour representatives, management representatives, in getting input towards the structure of that review?
Mr. Speaker, I indicated that while I was working with my staff on recommendations, the actual decision as to the makeup of that committee will be made by Cabinet.
Second main question, Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, my questions I'd like to direct to the Premier. It flows from the friendly little chit-chat that he had yesterday with the federal MPs, Alberta MPs. My question is, what position did the Premier put forward to the MPs on natural gas deregulation? Did he finally say, for example, that to the federal people that the November 1st deadline is unrealistic?
Mr. Speaker, as I said yesterday, we had a good discussion on a variety of matters for 3.5 hours. I didn't consider it in any way friendly little chit-chat, but very serious discussion on problems that are facing the people of Alberta. In terms of gas deregulation, Mr. Speaker, as I've said before in the House, that is covered in an agreement that involves the federal government, the government of Saskatchewan, the government of Alberta, and the government of British Columbia. It has wide-ranging impact on the industry as well, and on the people of Alberta and their resources, and of course of other provinces. Therefore, the matter needs to be reviewed in some depth. Presently, there is an agreement calling for deregulation to start on November the 1st, 1986. There have been some changes in the conditions facing industry, and there have been some conditions imposed by the National Energy Board, all of which have caused industry and governments to feel that it's necessary to take a second look at that deregulation date. It may be that that assessment will lead to a decision not to deregulate, but it may also be that the imbalance, and there are many, many who are recommending that deregulation go ahead. It may be imbalanced that we decide, all of the people who have signed that agreement, not to change it. But those are matters, I've told the House many times now, are being assessed.
Well, time is running out, Mr. Speaker. It's July the 18th. Might remind the Premier, but just to make the Premier's position very clear, because he feels he's misquoted often. At this point, the provincial government then wants to move ahead with the natural gas agreement on November 1st, even though the price of gas is at a historic low. Is that the position of this government?
Well, Mr. Speaker, he'll have to read Hansard again because I just stated the position of the government.
I guess it's, if necessary, gas deregulation, but not necessarily gas deregulation. But to come back to this chit-chat that he had, Mr. Speaker, the Deputy Prime Minister, yes, you can ask a question if you like. The Deputy Prime Minister was on television last night noting that we receive billions of dollars in energy revenue as a province. Sort of the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Globe and Mail line, I might say, Mr. Speaker. My question to the Premier, what reason has the Premier to believe that even our Alberta MPs, let alone the rest of the federal Tories, understand how dependent this government is on energy royalties and how seriously this energy crisis is hurting the province?
Mr. Speaker, I feel they have the message passed to them both by our government and by the people of this province. And they are aware of the serious nature of the instability and energy crisis. I might say, Mr. Speaker, we have had a greater problem dealing with this instability of energy prices on this province because we were so badly weakened by the National Energy Program that was supported by both of the parties opposite.
Very good. That's all.
Mr. Speaker, whenever they can't answer the question, they go back to the 60s and the 70s. My question is, and I was talking about the Deputy Prime Minister, but the MP for Athabasca said on CBC Radio this morning that the issue of loan guarantees for Hibernia was not even mentioned during yesterday's meeting. Now that's, to me, rather an amazing admission. And I asked the Premier, is that right? And did the Premier not even mention the unfairness of Hibernia possibly receiving loan guarantees while our upgrader guarantees seem to have disappeared? And if he didn't, why not?
The Chair is very concerned when it comes to supplementary questions as to the fact that we're having 2 and 3 supplementals plus comments being thrown in. In addition, with respect to this supplementary question, Honourable Leader of the Opposition, please make reference with respect to what happens in the Assembly, rather asking comment with respect to the media. Perhaps you could just rephrase that question succinctly.
No, Mr. Speaker. My question is that to the Premier, simply straightforward. Was it raised, the Hibernia situation? And if not, why not?
Mr. Speaker, I can't account for what the honourable member hears on the CBC. Nevertheless, my recollection, which is clear in my mind, is that the Hibernia matter was discussed.
Member for West Loch Sturgeon.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker, to the Premier. Speaking of NEP, it was his genius that kept the PGRT and dropped the floor price out of the agreement. But will the government, will his government respond favorably? This is a very easy one. Will he respond favorably to the small companies' request, Alberta small companies' request for relief from the provincial freehold mineral tax?
Mr. Speaker, we have many discussions with members of industry, and we consider seriously all of their representations to us.
Main question, Leader of the Liberal Party.
Mr. Speaker, also to the Premier. So on July the 7th, the Minister of Energy, the Alberta Minister of Energy, indicated in this legislature, replied to a question from me, that he had given no consideration to the consequences of eliminating the PGRT. Perhaps the Premier has taken the initiative to give this important matter the consideration it deserves, since he said yesterday that it's PGRT or nothing. Now, has the government undertaken a study to determine what percentage of the $700 million PGRT, if it is returned, will go to Canadian-owned oil companies as opposed to foreign-owned oil companies?
Good point.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, with the comments leading up to the question, I think the honourable member for Westlock Sturgeon is very inaccurate in saying what the Minister of Energy replied. Secondly, there's considerable speculation as to the amount of the PGRT. He has said $700 million. It obviously fluctuates a great deal depending on the price for energy. And it could be considerably lower than that, could be higher than that. There's no magic about his $700 million. There are only some 52 companies now who pay the PGRT. I don't think that's important. I don't think it's important that it be Canadian or American companies. The important thing is to have it removed.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker, to the Premier. It indicates his naivety if he doesn't think it's important, which one. But what, you can ask if you get your turn, what precautions will be taken by the government to ensure that the amount of money returned, let's not argue about the amount, will be spent in Alberta when the tax is dropped?
Mr. Speaker, first of all, I didn't say the PGRT was not important. I said the important factor was to have it removed. Mr. Speaker, I believe the federal government is considering the problems as to whether just removal of the PGRT tax is the way to do it, or whether they should have in some way incentives tied into it to have the funds spent in order to have the tax removed from companies' books. I don't know how they are going to resolve that matter. Nevertheless, we want it removed.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker. The Premier is waiting for the wisdom of the federal government to bail him out. He's going to wait a long time. Has, change of pace here, has the government checked its files to determine whether an agreement was actually signed before the last federal election between the federal and provincial governments for the Husky Upgrader project? Was there a signed agreement done before the last election?
Mr. Speaker, I wasn't here, but I can recall some of the reports regarding it, and I'll give first my impression, and then I will give a commitment to make sure that the document is produced. My impression was that there was an agreement signed, and that the federal government, the government of Saskatchewan, the government of Alberta, and Husky signed that agreement.
Mr. Supplementary, Mr. Speaker, the last one. There has been some impression given by federal MPs that there was no agreement, or if it was on the back of an envelope. But did the Premier, up to date, did the Premier compromise the original Husky Upgrader agreement, if there was one, letting the federal government off the hook in order to get the short-term funding for the engineering studies that he now has in place? Did he let him off the hook by getting his engineering study?
No, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Mink, Leader of the Opposition.
Yes, just to follow up on the PGRT, and we all recognize it should come off. But what happens after, I believe, is important, Mr. Premier. And my question is, does the government have any studies that would lead to indicate that there would be an increase, because of that extra money going to the majors, of buying out smaller Canadian independent companies, that that's what the money would be used for?
Mr. Speaker, we wouldn't study that. It's possible, Mr. Speaker, that companies will use it in a whole variety of ways, and you would think the Leader of the Opposition would know that as well. They may well use it for stepping up their exploration and development programs. They will possibly use it for paying off bank loans, possibly use it for buying companies. Those are individual decisions that companies would make. And we believe in the system of having the private sector make those decisions, not have regulation taking away freedom from people, as proposed by the members opposite.
Leader of the Representative Party.
buy condos in California.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the provincial treasurer, and it's with regards to the Prince Rupert Grain Limited terminal. Presently, the terminal, in terms of operating funds, is running a deficit and are requesting a break in repayment terms. The Alberta government's involved with some $220 million in loans and guarantees through the Heritage Savings Trust Fund. I'd like to ask the provincial treasurer what actions have been taken by the government, and are negotiations proceeding at the present time with regards to this condition of the Prince Rupert Grain Terminal.
Mr. Speaker, that in fact is an accurate update of some of the problems which Prince Rupert Terminal is experiencing. Through a variety of ministries, the province of Alberta is seeking ways to alleviate the at least short-term cash flow problems which the terminal is experiencing. I know my colleague, the Minister of Federal and Intergovernmental Affairs, has been involved with discussions with the province of BC on the question of input costs surrounding property and property tax assessment. And I know that the Minister of Economic Development and the Minister of Agriculture are also reviewing on a very broad policy basis ways to stimulate in the short term cash flow assistance. From our side, of course, on the Treasury side, we are both concerned but seeking ways to assist on the cash flow requirements for servicing the debt which have been provided by the province of Alberta. Nonetheless, Mr. Speaker, this project is important to the farm community and the farm sector in Alberta in terms of accessing the Pacific Rim countries, and we will stand behind that decision to make sure that that terminal continues to operate.
Mr. Speaker, a supplementary question to the provincial treasurer, and it's with regards to the interest rate. The cost of interest is some $24 million to the plant. Is one of the items being negotiated at the present time is the current interest rate on the Heritage Savings Trust Fund loan or guarantee to the terminal?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, that would be one of the possibilities. We must keep in mind, or certainly in context of these discussions, the fact that the private sector is operating these terminals. Now, I think it would be somewhat irresponsible from our side if we were to simply recognize all the charges assessed against the project by the private grain companies. I'm not suggesting that there's anything in terms of mismanagement or anything wrong with the charges, but we would not want to give up our charges, our revenue to the Heritage Fund, simply to allow the private sector to run up additional costs. And that's the difficult balance which we have to play here. But, of course, we are concerned about the investment in the Heritage Fund. We do not want to lose that revenue because, as you properly know, Mr. Speaker, we are using the income flow from the Heritage Fund to assist the General Revenue Fund and, in part, reducing and maintaining a very low income tax regime here in this province. So it all does come back to the Heritage Fund. We're concerned about the cash flow with respect to the terminals, and we're looking, as I've indicated, Mr. Speaker, for ways to assist the terminal short of providing implicit income transfers to the private sector.
Mr. Speaker, supplementary question to the Minister of Agriculture. Currently, in Alberta, we have elevators plugged where quotas cannot be delivered because of a lack of hopper cars, as I understand it. At the same time, we have the Prince Rupert Terminal indicating that there is not an adequate flow of grain through the terminal to bring about revenue that's necessary. I was wondering if the Minister could indicate what actions are being taken with regards to those specific problems to assist this problem that exists with the Prince Rupert Terminal.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure the Honourable Minister of Economic Development would wish to supplement this as it falls under his jurisdiction. But we have taken a number of actions, and maybe I should share with the Honourable Member and with the House for those farmers that are having difficulties in getting their grain to the elevators because of blockage. I have been informed this morning that Alberta Terminals Limited does have space in the event that the farmers do wish to travel those few extra miles to get rid of their grain. They can take it to Alberta Terminals, whereby they can have it distributed to the grain company of their choosing, and receipts will be issued.
The Minister, supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the throughput of Prince Rupert grain has been somewhat less than anticipated, and there are a number of factors that have contributed to that. One of them, the major ones, is the drought that has occurred in Western Canada during the last 2 years. And we expect, though, before the end of the current crop year, an additional 1,300 cars to be unloaded at Rupert. Another factor in terms of the throughput is the the unloadings for export that occur at Rupert as opposed to other ports, and that has an impact in terms of the throughput of the terminal. The provincial treasurer indicated that there were some costs that were unanticipated as a result of very high property tax assessment, and Federal and Intergovernmental Affairs has had some success with the appeal, but there's further work being done in that regard.
Supplementary question to the Minister of Economic Development and Trade, and it's relative to the grain handlers in the facility. The Minister indicate whether there's any problems relative to the grain handlers. I understand they're in a strike position, and will that position create any problems relative to flow through of grain in the facility?
Mr. Speaker, we're aware that negotiations are going on between the grain handlers and the consortium. It's not clear to us whether that the negotiations that are going on have interfered with the throughput of the terminal.
Member for West Loch Sturgeon.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker. This back to the provincial treasurer and the Heritage Trust Fund financing of the grain terminals. If it appears that the Heritage Trust Fund is expected to bail out the private owners, do we have a mechanism in place that the Heritage Trust Fund could foreclose and take over the terminals if it appears that the private sector is just going to be a continuous case of being bailed out?
Well, Mr. Chairman, this government will avoid that wherever possible. We believe that the imagination and the decision-making can best be done by the private sector, not by government.
Member for Stadler, followed by the member for Edmonton Millwoods.
Mr. Speaker, my question is directed to the Minister of Agriculture. The National Farmers Union has submitted a petition requesting a plebiscite be held on the question of the checkoff which funds the activities of the Alberta Cattle Commission. Can he advise this Assembly as to the present status of that petition?
Mr. Speaker, as the honourable member for Stettler has indicated, the National Farmers Union did submit a petition to the Marketing Council. We are awaiting a recommendation from the Marketing Council as to the validity of that petition and as to the numbers of it. When the recommendation is forwarded to me, it is my hope to have broad discussions as it relates to the petition, and I'm not about to comment any further until I have the recommendation itself from the Marketing Council. I just feel it would be rather unwise for me to involve myself in a debate because we don't know what area that debate is going to revolve around.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker. Given the considerable contributions made by the Cattle Commission in the marketing of Alberta beef, will the minister take a public position in support of the Cattle Commission?
Mr. Speaker, I'm more than happy to do so, and I again underscore what the honourable member for Stettler has indicated. The Alberta Cattle Commission has served in a very commendable way the cattle industry in this province. They have indicated to me some concerns as it relates to the plebiscite in the event that we do decide to go ahead with it. But in the event that I receive the recommendation from the Marketing Council, I want to not only assure the honourable member from Stettler, but the Alberta Cattle Commission and the National Farmers Union that we are going to have a thorough discussion as to what process we follow up after I have the recommendation from the Marketing Council.
Member for Edmonton Millwoods, followed by the member for Lloydminster.
Mr. Speaker, my question is directed to the Minister of Economic Development, and I direct it to him in the context of your own comments, Mr. Speaker, about the Commonwealth and our tradition with it, and the concern that I'm sure all members of the Assembly must have about the Commonwealth's possible disintegration over the question of South Africa. My question to the Minister is, in light of the Federal All-Party Committee's recommendation yesterday for Canada to take stronger economic sanctions against the racist regime of South Africa if there is no substantive action to dismantle apartheid by the 30th of September, and in light of the information that he himself filed yesterday about sulphur exports to that country, can the Minister assure the Assembly today that his department will be taking aggressive steps to seek alternative markets for Alberta sulphur production that is now going to South Africa?
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Federal and Intergovernmental Affairs may wish to supplement my answer. I think earlier in the question period, I'd responded to a similar question that the government of Alberta does not actively market our products. We support the private sector in their efforts in achieving markets for Alberta goods and services, and we do that aggressively. We do not get involved in terms of the politics of other nations within the Department of Economic Development and Trade. Our involvement is enhancing trade opportunities and job creation for Albertans. With respect to foreign policy of this country, that's a matter that is dealt with by the federal government. As I said, the Minister of Federal and Intergovernmental Affairs may wish to supplement my answer.
Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker. It's unfortunate again that we're not seeing any leadership from the provincial level. But in that case, to go back to the public sector, perhaps, can the Minister assure the House that he will direct his own officials in the Agency for International Development to meet with officials from the Canadian International Development Agency to consider the possible development of a fertilizer plant using Alberta sulfur in one of the frontline states in southern Africa?
Mr. Speaker, I didn't clearly hear all of the elements of the question, but our Alberta International Aid Program has been a very successful program in assisting third world countries, in assisting non-governmental organizations who raise funds to assist in those nations, and will continue to do that. The requests come in on a regular basis through the department, and we deal with them and respond to them as we're able based on budget and based on the particular application.
Supplementary question to the Minister of Consumer Affairs, Mr. Speaker. I wonder if the Minister could assure us that she will be consulting with firms that are importing fruit from the racist regime in South Africa and use her influence to have them discontinue this practice.
For Edmonton Mill Woods, it's considered unparliamentary to use phrases, a term such as racist with regard to another government with which Canada does indeed have relationships. Consumer and Corporate Affairs. Excuse me, is there a response? Further supplementary, member for Edmonton Mill Woods.
Since the Minister of Consumer Affairs is unable to answer the question to the Premier, considering...
That's a false supposition. Would you please continue with the supplementary question?
Considering the rising tide of public indignation over the developments in southern Africa, can the Premier assure the Assembly that he will follow the example of the Manitoba government and direct all the departments of his government to see what additional measures they may be able to take to keep in step with the latest initiative that we have from the federal government made public yesterday?
Mr. Speaker, well, I don't know all of the views of the members opposite. I would assume that every member of this Legislative Assembly disassociates themselves strongly as possible with those policies of the Government of South Africa that support the apartheid rules. We all do. But, Mr. Speaker, to the honourable member, surely what he is trying to do is to help the people of South Africa. There is absolutely no proof that by taking away from them things that they need and things that they require, that you are going to help them. Now, surely, Mr. Speaker, if the people of South Africa need certain products, by taking them away from them, how does that help them? You have to take, with some sensitivity and thought, not trying to merely make some political points, you have to have some sensitivity and thought about a very major problem. And I would suggest that the honourable member, with his comments leading up to his question, is not using sensitivity and thoughtfulness, but is rather just trying to make a very narrow political point.
It's a supplementary, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister of Trade. Will he explain how he equates his statement that he does not interfere where Alberta is selling a natural resource like sulfur, when the Premier has repeatedly said in this House that he will and would discriminate on who he would sell natural gas to.
Mr. Speaker, I have to respond to that. I haven't said I would discriminate on people. You asked your question. Mr. Speaker, the point we've made in the House continually is that both our legislation and our leases require that we do not allow resources to be sold wastefully low prices. We will continue to fulfill that responsibility. That is not a discrimination against any individual or country.
Member for Lloydminster, followed by the member for Edmonton Meadowlark.
Mr. Speaker, I direct my question to the Minister of Agriculture, and I would ask him if he has a timeline as to when he receives a report from the Marketing Council regarding the NFU plebiscite.
Mr. Speaker, in response to the honourable member from Lloydminster, may I just prefix it by commending the members on the government side for the leadership and responsible questions they put in this House on a consistent basis as compared to the garbage we hear from the other side. And did you really expect anything? May I also indicate to the honourable member from Lloydminster that we're hopeful to have the report from the Marketing Council very soon so that we can take action on this pressing issue.
Supplementary question. Member for Edmonton Meadowlark, followed by the member for Athabasca-Lac-La-Biche.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. It's difficult to understand, actually, that we could be negotiating for a $1 billion Husky Oil upgrader agreement and not know as a government one important feature, whether or not we have a signed... I get a preamble.
Honourable members of the Assembly, on the main question, the member is indeed entitled to a brief preamble.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Maybe I'll repeat it. It's difficult to understand how we could be negotiating for a $1 billion revenue or assistance to this province and not know whether or not we have a signed agreement, which would be an incredibly important feature of our leverage in that negotiation. And I'm very concerned that another incredibly important feature of another policy will be missed: leadership in cost cutting. Could the Treasurer please confirm a recent Treasury Board decision to allow the four most recent ex-ministers still sitting in this legislature to keep their ministerial car allowance?
Oh. Quite a preamble.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the words of the Minister of Agriculture just recently ring in my ears right now.
Correct. Supplementary question.
Interesting answer. Can the Minister please confirm that these car allowances, ministerial car allowances, and the car allowance for the Leader of the Opposition have just been increased $2,000?
Mr. Speaker, with respect to the expenditure side of what the minister or the member is talking about, as he well knows, these estimates are set, and their ministerial votes are explained in the House, and he's had ample opportunity to go through every one of the ministerials who has now appeared before the Committee of Supply, and I'm sure each minister will be glad to tell him just what their ministerial car allowance may well be. Mr. Speaker, I'm not too sure what the member is getting at, as I'm sure no one else is in the province of Alberta.
The Chair, in recognizing additional supplementals on this issue, cautions the member that indeed this material is germane to estimates rather than this period of the day.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Leadership is an absolutely critical feature of cost cutting. Decisions are being made behind closed doors that we can't get information about. There is not detailed information in the estimates. This is a matter for consideration here. What kind of message is this government sending to the people of Alberta, for whom they speak, for each and every one of them, the Treasurer says, when they're not providing leadership in cutting important personal perks? In fact, they're increasing personal perks.
Mr. Speaker, the member has then asked me to perhaps provide a very detailed analysis of how this government allocates resources, and I welcome the opportunity to briefly overview some of the ways in which this government has, in an imaginative and careful way, been able to ascertain and effectively allocate resources given to us by this province. First of all, let me draw the members' attention to the last statement of accounts which were filed in this Assembly, showing a surplus of over $1 billion when in fact we had anticipated or budgeted for a deficit of $300 million.
You forgot.
That has to be a very careful management of the resources of this province, and this government is well known for that very important criteria in all of its decisions. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, there have been some questions raised as to how it is we assess and determine capital investment decisions over the last few days, and I think this opportunity should be taken to comment on those. First of all, Mr. Speaker, in any capital investment decisions, we very carefully analyze the cost-benefit analysis.
It took an hour on it.
Thank you, Honourable. Thank you, Honourable Minister, for reminding us that the information is indeed public and available from other sources. The Chair recognizes the member for Athabasca-Lac-La-Biche, followed by the Honourable Member for Edmonton-Meadowlark. You have expended your question plus your 3 supplementals. The Chair recognizes the member for Athabasca-Lac-La-Biche, followed by the member for Red Deer North, if there is time.
To the Solicitor General, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have statistics from the Solicitor General's annual report about the admission of young people to young offenders facilities. 33% of those admitted are Native, in a province with only 3.3% Native people in the overall population. What action is the Solicitor General taking to correct this shameful situation?
Mr. Speaker, the Native population in the Solicitor General institutions, I believe the report that the Honourable Member for Athabasca is referring to indicates that it has decreased in the past year. The Solicitor General utilizes the Native Counselling Service together with Native volunteer probation officers to work with the Native population to try to keep them from the institutions, as well as the Department is attempting to implement policies whereby fewer people are incarcerated and are held under alternate programs such as fine options, temporary releases, probation.
Mr. Speaker, may I supplement the Honourable Minister's answer? I think this also relates to the social services area, because indeed, prior to the age grouping that the Honourable Minister is speaking to and the Honourable Member has asked about, there have been many Native and Métis children in the care of the Social Services Department. If the Honourable Member was present when the estimates of this department were discussed on Wednesday last, he would have noted that there has been great strides made under the new Child Welfare Act and a move to provide Native communities with the resources so that they may indeed look after their children as it's their desire to do, that there have been several agreements already signed, and that this department will be sponsoring bursaries to assist the Native community in their effort to have their people educated and be able to handle this particular situation.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker. Unfortunately, the rate of incarceration has not decreased over the past year. In Alberta, the number of youth in custody or detention has increased 230% since January of 1985. With all young people, there is far too much incarceration in the application of the Young Offenders Act when other programs are available. What analysis has the Solicitor General done about why more use is not made of programs like alternative measures and community-based programs?
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, the Young Offenders Act was initially a federal act which the province of Alberta agreed to join in with cost sharing. Initially, youth over the age of 16 were handled as adults and under 16 as juvenile delinquents. Up till April 1984, the 12 to 14-year-olds were in fact brought in under the Young Offenders Act, and in April of 1985, the ages of 16 and 17 were then added. This, of course, has added to the population of the young offenders. Also, I might point out that the penalties imposed by the youth court are under the jurisdiction of the Attorney General. He may wish to supplement the answer. I might indicate that we have at present 533 young offenders under custody, which could be open custody, could be temporary detention, could be temporary release, or it could be under secure custody. We also have 2,738 on probation for a total population of approximately 20% that are incarcerated.
I'd like to supplement the answer given by the Honourable Solicitor General. This is an area where it is difficult to make comparisons relative to the number of people incarcerated because the Young Offenders Act has just come into effect. But reference was made in the supplementary to alternative measures, and the alternative measures program introduced, which is one of the most advanced of any province in Canada, in the first year of its operation, and keeping in mind the figures just given to the Assembly by the Honourable Solicitor General as to the number of young people incarcerated, was able, through the alternative measures program, to deal with 1,397 cases of young offenders and to prevent them from appearing at all in the courts, and to work out through that program, which is very extensive and which I dealt with in my estimates the other day with a rather lengthy reference to the program. It has proved to be very effective. In addition, as I indicated in my estimates, we are proposing a number of additional offenses to be added to those which are now covered. And I think that that type of program is the correct and approach to dealing with first-time young offenders, so that when one keeps in mind the figures that have been mentioned, that particular program has been a very great success, and we intend to follow up and to expand upon it.
Excuse me, Honourable Member. The time for question period has expired. Will the Assembly agree to the Assembly completing this series of questions and supplementaries? Thank you. Honourable Member for Athabasca-Lac-La Biche.
Isn't the Solicitor General worried about that with incarcerating 18-year-old young people with 12, 13, 14-year-old, that we're not perhaps just simply creating more permanent type of criminal activity later on? When you look at the high adult native incarceration rate of 28%, are we not just simply increasing that rate by mixing up the population between 18 and 12?
Mr. Speaker, we don't incarcerate 18-year-olds as young offenders. They're considered adults. The young offender takes from 12 until 17. I believe that our programs and our efforts to move these young offenders out of the institutions onto the alternate measures is significant.
Final supplementary. Could the Solicitor General indicate what consultation and cooperation is taking place between the departments of education, for example, social service and manpower, to develop a better program for youth who are admitted to facilities to reduce the chance of repeat offenders?
Mr. Speaker, the Solicitor General works very closely with the Department of Education and the Social Services Department. We have a vast array of educational services that are being provided to the young offenders from grades 1 to grade 12, vocational training, post-release and pre-release training. We're working constantly in updating these particular programs. Most institutions work hand in hand with the school district for the community in which the institution is located, and I think we're having great success.
Speaker, I'd like to supplement the answers of the provincial treasurer to the honourable member from Edmonton Meadowlark. His comments regarding, sorry, Mr. Speaker.
This comes under the heading of supplementary information given earlier in the day. Therefore, the chair assumes unanimous consent of the House, following upon the declaration yesterday. Premier.
And I recognize the honourable member will then have a chance, which I'm giving him, to ask his supplemental question that he couldn't get in before, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the House has decided in the past that certain people require cars in order to fulfill their responsibilities. We believe that the Leader of the Opposition requires one to fulfill his responsibilities. We believe that members of the Executive Council do too. Mr. Speaker, I believe the Office of the Speaker, the House has decided, requires one as well to perform their responsibilities. It's no different than the funds that are provided to the member from Edmonton Meadowlark in research dollars to allow him to fulfill his responsibilities. Now, if the cost of a researcher goes up, we provide additional funds to take care of that price increase. What has happened is that the cost of automobiles has gone up, and there has been an increase to allow for that cost increase. These are not some kind of special personal perks, as he was referring to at all. They are things that this Legislative Assembly votes on and approves in order that people can conduct their responsibilities in the manner that the House decides they should. And we will always continue to provide the honourable member with the dollars that he needs to fulfill his responsibility in research and other ways, and to other members that the House decides need certain dollars granted by the people of Alberta. And I think we should be clear that there is not any special thing being done for somebody. His reference then, Mr. Speaker, was to cabinet ministers continuing their car allowance. Ex-cabinet ministers, right. Mr. Speaker, ex-cabinet ministers do not carry their car allowance. If they take on responsibilities that require the provision of an automobile, and that's a judgment that's taken, then they are provided. But it has nothing to do with the fact that they are ex-cabinet ministers.
Mr. Speaker, would I be able to ask my second supplementary as well at this time?
Sorry, just roll it into this, please.
Okay. I think the Premier is missing my point, although I would at some point like to debate the need for cars. The real question is the increase of $2,000 to ministers and deputy ministers' car allowances is $17,200 net of federal taxes, not sufficient to purchase a perfectly acceptable, adequate car for doing any kind of government business? Do we need to buy top-of-the-line cars at this time when we should be sending messages to Albertans and to all of those people who are responsible, every employee who's responsible for cutting costs? One. Secondly, can we please see these kinds of decisions being made? Can Treasury Board minutes please be released to the public and to this legislature so that we can properly evaluate government expenditures which are going behind closed doors?
Well, Mr. Speaker, there are no expenditures of a government that are carried on behind closed doors. They're all reviewed by the legislature. They're reviewed afterwards by public accounts. Over the years of the parliamentary tradition, there has been exhaustive methods provided for the reviewing of government expenditures. The honourable member will appreciate that the longer he is in the House. All of the provisions are there. There are post-audits, there are pre-audits. All of the conditions are there to make sure that there are no funds expended without the House being aware of it. In terms of the increase, Mr. Speaker, it's a judgment that the dollars necessary for a vehicle should match the responsibilities of the individual. They go with the office. They don't go with the person. I suppose the member has a judgment that he would want in some way a car of smaller size or something, I suppose, but that's a matter of argument. I happen to believe that the people of Alberta want to provide to those people who have responsibilities to carry out important tasks, whether it be the Speaker or the Leader of the Opposition or members of Cabinet. They want them to be able to carry out that task in a manner that they approve of, and that's what we're trying to do. And I have no problems with providing to them the funds for research that are required, the funds for their vehicles that are required.
Orders of the day.